In Chapter 6 of our study of introductory economics, we continue our look at the mechanics of our economic engine or system by looking at the component of supply. Before we start this chapter, I want to offer up some important advice. In Chapter 5, we looked at our economic engine and its goods and services from a demand or a consumption perspective. In this chapter, we're going to shift our thinking. In this chapter, we must think like producers or managers of businesses. In effect, we're going to look at goods and services from a production perspective. Many times I like to use the analogy where last chapter we were looking at our economic engine with one side of our brain. Now we're going to look at it with the other side. The analogy of comparing chapters 5 and 6 to thinking with different sides of our brains is actually a pretty good one. You may be familiar with the fact that our brains are symmetrical, in some ways mirror images of each other, one side of our brain to the other. Well, when I cover the chapter contents here, you'll see that Chapter 6 is structured very similar to Chapter 5, and some of the underlying concepts and the way supply will be introduced to you are the same. For example, there is a formal definition of the concept of supply, which we'll get into in a moment here. And there is a law of supply, similar to the fact that there is a law of demand. There is a supply curve, which we'll introduce you to, and it has characteristics similar to, in many ways, the demand curve. And supply, just like demand, is sensitive to price changes, and we'll talk a little bit about elasticity of supply. But here's a difference. Because we're talking about thinking of like producers or managers of businesses, costs have an impact on supply to a market. And we're going to do a little bit more work in understanding business costs and profits in this chapter. And then we'll wrap this chapter up by talking about what things can cause overall changes in supply to a given market. So let's get started. Let's start with a definition of the concept of supply as it's used in the study of economics. Supply is defined as the relationship between price and quantity of goods and services that are produced. And because we're talking about price here as it relates to supply, similar to what we did in the demand chapter, we take a snapshot in time to illustrate the concept. So we invoke the economic concept of ceteris paribus, meaning that when we look at supply to a market, we hold all other things that can affect supply off and just look at the price change or illustrate the price change. We'll get to the other things that can have an effect on supply to a market a little bit later on, but right now we're looking fundamentally at price. Now, a couple of things with regard to our graph. You'll notice that it's the same graph generally that we use to illustrate demand in Chapter 5. Let's start with the axes. The vertical axis is labeled the same as it was in the demand chapter as price. The horizontal axis is still labeled quantity, but in this case, for the moment, we're looking at quantity supplied as opposed to quantity demanded. Now let's take a look at a couple of characteristics about your supply curve, which we're introducing you to here for the first time. It looks the opposite, if you will, of a demand curve. Where a demand curve slopes downward from left to right, a supply curve slopes downward from right to left. So it's the opposite. Also note here that what gets supplied to a market is really the opposite of what is demanded. For example, going back to the demand chapter, we know that the higher the price for a good or service, the lower the quantity that is demanded. But here we have the opposite. It's illustrated by your supply curve, if you will. that the higher the price that can be obtained for a good or service, producers will supply more to a market. The lower the price that they can get for a product, they lose interest, if you will, and supply less to a market. That leads us right into our definition of the law of supply. The law of supply says the higher the price that can be obtained for a good or service, the larger the quantity that will be produced and supplied to the market. And that's clearly reflected in our chart. For example, if you look at a price of 5, far more is being supplied of a good or service to a market at a level of 60 in this chart than at a price of 1. There is a corollary to this law of supply, and it reads as such. If prices fall, for example, down to that price level of 1 that we just saw in the chart, some producers will produce less and others will stop producing completely. So the question is, where do they go? Where do these producers that stop producing go off to? Well, if you recall back to Chapter 2, where we introduced you to the concept of opportunity costs, the money that they're investing in their business to produce some product or service, if they can't get a reasonable price for it, they're better off taking that money they invest in the business and investing it in some other opportunity where the return on investment and the return on capital would be better. There are some cases where, if for some reason, if prices drop too low, some businesses shut down or go into hibernation for a period of time until the market improves and prices rise and the opportunity cost of investing in the business again to produce becomes reasonable or better than some other opportunities. So now we're ready to take a look at the 5 causes of changes in supply to a market. The first one would obviously be a change in price. But remember that a change in price changes quantity supplied, not total supply. Let's say, for example, with our chart that we've been looking at here, it represents the market for oranges. Based upon the resources available to produce oranges and based in conjunction with the costs of production and administrative costs and so forth, this chart would represent what would be produced and supplied to the market at given price levels. Now, obviously, if some conditions change, for example, if resources change, where all of a sudden there was more resources available to produce oranges, the same thing that we looked at with a demand curve shifting on the chart is going to get applied here to supply, and we're going to shift the curve either to the right or the left on the chart. But we'll get to that in a moment as to what type of conditions could change to change total supply to a market. But going back to our first cause here, a change in price will only affect a change in quantity supplied, not the total supply to the market. Now, with regard to elasticity or sensitivity to price changes, the same type of rules apply to the concept of supply to a market, generally as applied to demand, meaning that the measure of the way suppliers respond to a change in price, meaning a higher price, more production, is the measure is the same that we look at in the demand chapter. And you'll notice here in the equation that we use, we have simply substituted quantity supplied for quantity demanded. So you can figure out the sensitivity in a price change on supply by using the same formula. And what you will find, just like with demand, is that supply to a market is sensitive to price changes differently at each price level. Now, a little different than with the concept of demand, there are two additional facts about supply elasticity that we need to cover. Here's the first. The supply of goods to a market are generally inelastic to price change. And what we mean by that is meaning how much gets supplied to a market is inelastic to a price change in the short run because of production and distribution time playing a significant role in what can be supplied. Now, before I give you an example to illustrate this, let me cover something else with you that we need to give you some background on. You may not be familiar with the concept of short run or long run. When we compare things, especially in business and economics, quite often we talk about the short run and long run. And here's simply what we're talking about. Short run is observations over short periods of time. It could be days, weeks, or months, maybe even stretching to a year, okay? And long run are for longer periods of time, years, 5-year periods, maybe even decades or longer. So let me give you an example of this fact about goods being inelastic in the short run because of production, meaning the actual producing of the good or service, and distribution time. Let's say in a hypothetical example, we have a town in which there are two office supply stores, a Staples and an Office Max. And something happens where the Office Max store burns down and is out of business for a period of time. And let's say it was during the back to school shopping season, and people are in the market for, or students and parents are in the market for markers for students going back to school. Well, certainly Staples might be inclined, because they're the only game in town, with Office Max being out of business for a period of time until they rebuild their store, to raise the prices that they charge on markers because the customers only have one place to go. The marker manufacturer would certainly like to sell more markers through that Staples store, but can only supply to that market in that short period of time what they have already supplied, or going forward in the short term can only get a certain amount of markers to that store because, first of all, they have to manufacture them and then ship them to the location. So it takes them a period of time to respond to the price increase that they could take, which makes the supply of the goods provided sort of inelastic or less sensitive to a price change that has occurred, meaning a higher price. On the other hand, the supply of services are generally elastic, meaning sensitive to price change, both in the long and the short run. And the reason for this is that with regard to services, there are usually no considerations with regard to the actual production or manufacturing of some good or distribution. If we take the example illustrated here in the picture of a barber, if for some reason a barber cannot get a certain price for the haircuts that he or she is offering, and I say a certain price that would allow them to cover their costs as well as make a reasonable return, they will probably, based upon opportunity costs, go to some other line of work and stop offering haircuts. And this can be done virtually at a moment's notice because there's no consideration in providing that haircut service of producing something or distributing something. Now, we're ready to move on to the other factors that can have an impact on supply to a market. And these other factors are the factors that will actually cause a supply curve to shift on our chart. So let's take a look at these. Now, of the four other causes other than price of changes in supply to a market, they will have an impact on total supply, which means that our supply curve is going to shift on our chart. If there is a factor that will increase total supply to the market, our curve will be shifted to the right. If there is a factor that will cause a decrease in total supply to the market, our curve will be shifted to the left. Now, please make a very important note here that notice I did not use the terms to describe the curve shifts as up and down on the chart, because if you focus in here on the decrease in total supply, the shift of the curve, it looks like it's moving up the chart. However, it represents a decrease, which most people associate or with a synonym of down in their mind, and that can present problems when explaining these shifts in markets and in supply and demand in future illustrations that you will need to make throughout the study of economics. So please don't use the terms up and down to describe supply curve shifts or curve shifts in any manner, whether it's demand or supply. Use the term shift to the right or shift to the left, and that will accurately describe the impact that's being had on the market. The first of the four things that can cause a change in total supply to a market and shift a supply curve is increases in variable cost of production for businesses. And why? Because it has a negative short-term impact on a business's ability to produce whatever good or service that they're producing. Now, we've talked about cost of production before in Chapter 2, but we didn't talk about types of cost of production specifically, for example, variable cost, which we'll need to do now here so that you have a more thorough understanding. And not only will we look at cost a little bit deeper, but we'll also look at profits in a little bit different way. So here are a couple of terms for you to give you a more thorough understanding of costs and profits. And just as a review for a moment, we know what revenue is. It's money taken in by the sale of products and services. Fixed costs are costs for a business that do not change. Some examples are rent, loan payments on equipment, licenses, and so forth. Variable costs are costs that do change, such as what workers are paid, wages, cost of supplies, cost of utilities. If you're not familiar with the word utilities, things like power used to run equipment, electricity to light a facility. And total cost, the concept of total cost, is where you take your fixed cost plus the variable cost to get a total cost picture for a business. As for new terms related to profit, here's the first one. Gross profit is revenue minus all costs. Net profit, also referred to as income, is gross profit minus taxes. So these new terms give us a new way to look at a profit model similar to the one that we looked at in Chapter 2. Here it is at the bottom of the screen. It says total revenue minus fixed costs minus variable costs will give you your gross profit. And if you take taxes from your gross profit, it leaves you with your net profit or income. a word or two about how these two costs, fixed costs and variable costs, relate back to Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we talked about cost of production and administrative costs. Well, let me take cost of production first. Cost of production could be a combination of fixed costs and variable costs. Administrative costs that we talked about in Chapter 2 are most likely to be costs that can be controlled or changed on rather short notice, and they would fall into the category of variable costs. Now, having been given a different perspective on costs, let's go back to the first thing that will affect a change in total supply to a market and shift a supply curve. And that was an increase in variable costs. So how does an increase in variable costs potentially change supply? And let's use an example. Let's say I'm manufacturing a product for which I need to buy supplies to make it. And I get a notification that the price that I've been paying for the supplies is going to go up immediately. That means for my next production run of the product that I'm manufacturing, I will have to pay more for my supplies, which means I need to take more out of my profits to make the same amount that I normally make for shipment. This will result in my ability to make less of my product. So let's take a look at the classic supply and demand graph and show how this is illustrated. And here we have a graph that we've included both the demand and the supply curves. Now, because I'm going to have to pay more for my supplies and therefore not be able to produce as much of my product, manufacture as much of my product as I had before, in the short term, I will ship more out to be sold. So therefore, supply will be decreased, and supply for the product in the market will decrease and shift the supply curve to the left because we can't produce as much in the short term. Now, you all can figure out very clearly and probably without even prompting from me as to what impact this is going to have on the market by virtue of where the new supply curve has been placed on the graph. And the additional costs for me as a manufacturer and supplier that I'm incurring will be reflected in my prices also for the product to my consumers. So you see the price increase, which will be passed on to the consumer. And usually what we see in these cases, by virtue of the price increasing, is a reduction in demand. The third cause of change to total supply to a market is actually the opposite side of the coin from an increase in variable costs. In other words, a reduction or decrease in variable costs that allow more of a good to be produced. This is quite often brought on by technology advances. For example, a manufacturer of a good that brings in a new piece of equipment that does one or a combination of two things, allows more to be produced per hour, or in some cases, can replace human workers, which are more expensive, with a more efficient machine. Now, what this will do in a market is it will move our supply curve, in this case, to the right. And even though I do not have a demand curve illustrated on this chart, I think you can clearly see, based upon the ground we've covered so far, is that an increase in supply is going to cause prices to fall. Now, this is usually a good thing for both producers, because they can sell more, and for consumers, because they get goods for less. However, producers need to watch this very, very closely, because as prices decrease, remember that it's less interesting, depending upon profit models, for a producer to supply to a market at lower prices. they may not be able to sustain their business in some cases. I'll give you an example of where this might actually get out of control. A number of years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, as technology advances began to hit the music industry, music became available to people in a very convenient format for free through downloading to computer and portable devices by such services as Napster. When this happened, it really threatened the viability of the music business, as the consumers were able to get music for free. Artists and musicians were not able to earn money for the work that they did, and it almost wound up killing off the music industry. Thankfully, through our rule of law, and particularly our focus on property rights and copyright law, the industry was able to embrace technology advances and restructure itself so that today we have a thriving and profitable for the artists music business, and at the same time consumers have more access to the supply, the music, through numerous devices at lower costs. The fourth cause of change to total supply in a market can come about as a result of one or a combination of four government actions. Here's the first. It's a subsidy. A subsidy is a government payment that supports a business or a market. In the United States, government subsidies are very commonly paid in the agricultural industry, especially to food producers. Food producers have convinced the government to pay them a subsidy for the following reasons. They say that they cannot run a profitable business if they are left to just compete against other global providers that have lower cost of production and have to compete on the global price for their product. They need something to boost up their profits to remain in business, and they look to the government to pay them a subsidy to do so. It's a supplement. They also say that if they did have to compete in the global market at the global price, they would probably go out of business. And therefore, the government would be putting the United States food supply at risk by having to depend on foreign producers for many key products. And that they position as a national security problem. So based upon these two things, they've convinced the government to pay them a subsidy or a price support, sometimes it's referred to as that, for them to maintain their business. Now, this encourages the agricultural food producer to produce as much as they can, because the more that they produce, the more they're going to get paid in subsidies. With that type of incentive, it continually pushes our supply curve to the right, which in the long run really doesn't help our problem, as that continues to help depress prices as more supply becomes available. The second type of government action that can have an impact on total supply to a market is the imposition of excise taxes. They're placed on businesses to discourage production and consumption. Excise taxes put an extra cost on each unit produced and sold. The most famous or recognizable set of excise taxes are probably the taxes on alcohol and tobacco. As cost of production raise on products, as we've seen before, that's an increase in a variable cost. Some may argue that it might be a fix, but it will move the supply curve to the left. A third government action that can have an effect on total supply in a market is the imposition of a tariff. A tariff is a tax that's imposed on foreign goods, which adds an extra cost for each unit sold, or what is produced, on the foreign producer. And just like with a domestic producer, with a more expensive cost of production, they can produce less and therefore supply our market with less product. Therefore, you have a reduction in supply, and this moves the curve for the product or service to the left. The fifth government action that can have an impact on supply is the imposition of regulations. What regulations are: the intervention to control some sort of business practice in a industry or a market, which winds up adding cost to run the business. And with an increase in cost, again, the producers can't produce as much profitably. It moves the curve to the left. Now, I will give you two quick examples of how the imposition of regulations on businesses and industries raise the cost of doing business and in turn force the producers in a particular industry to have to cut back what they supply to the market. The first example we've actually seen before in Chapter 2, and also you witnessed in your first chapter video. It's the case of the textile industry dealing with the brown lung disease. The federal government of the United States in this case came in and imposed the regulations of the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which required the textile companies to create a certain environment in the textile mills to eliminate the instances of brown lung. So expensive was the cost to implement the workplace regulations for the clean environment that it actually put United States textile companies out of business. Without them producing textiles for the domestic market, we obviously had a reduction in the supply to that market during that period. The second example comes in the form of state regulations. The state of California, a number of years ago, felt that the fish stock in the Pacific was being threatened by overfishing on the West Coast. So they acted to put in place a fishing ban on the amount of fish that could be taken in by fishing fleets and the type of fish as well. Without the ability to offer a diverse set of products and the operating costs for the fishing fleets remaining what it was prior to the ban, it really put a cost squeeze on many of the fishing fleets, and they had to wind up cutting back on their takes and also the types of takes, and as a result of that, raise prices. This limited supply to the market for seafood, and that's one of the reasons why today, if you go into the supermarket, especially here in the western part of the United States, where we get our seafood from California and the states on the coast, why seafood is as expensive as it is. The next and last cause, the fifth cause of changes to total supply in a market, would come from new entrants, meaning new companies or new suppliers into a market, which increases competition. As the new competitors come in, they offer their products and services, increasing supply into a market. And this shifts the curve for products offered in that market to the right. We're now ready to complete the demand and supply picture and look at what we call a market at equilibrium. That's a new term for you. What is equilibrium? Well, it's very simply stated as the combination of price and quantity at which the intentions of demanders or consumers and suppliers exactly match. To illustrate a market at equilibrium, we can do that with our classic supply and demand graph and bringing together the two curves that we've looked at, the demand curve and the supply curve. The market equilibrium point is the point at which the two curves intersect. It's the point at which the intentions of consumers match with the intentions of suppliers. Now, I'd like to make one other point before moving on from this slide, and I'd like to draw your attention to the two boxes, one that appears below the market equilibrium point and the one that appears above the market equilibrium point. These two boxes I'm going to talk about, or areas I'm going to talk about in a moment, represent certain market conditions that may wind up coming about. And they are particularly important to where we're going to go with our study in Chapter 7 with regard to prices. Now let me start with the area below the market equilibrium point. If you will take, for example, the price point of 1 for this product, whatever, it's not important what the product is, but for this market and this product, we know that at a price of 1, very few suppliers are interested in supplying product to the market. However, at a price point of 1, consumers would be very interested in consuming the product at that price point. When you have demand outstripping supply, you have a condition of a shortage in a market. So anywhere below the market equilibrium point in our illustration shows a shortage in a market. Now let's go to the area above the market equilibrium point. And let's choose the price point of 4. In this case, we know that suppliers are very willing to supply whatever the product is at a price point of 4. But at the higher price point of 4, consumers are far less interested in consuming the product at that price. So in this case, we have supply outstripping demand, and that results in a condition in the market of having a surplus, where you have more product than there is demand for it. These two concepts are going to play a pivotal role, as I mentioned, in our studies in Chapter 7, so please keep them in mind. In the prior slide, we illustrated a market at equilibrium. And based upon our study in Chapter 5 and here in Chapter 6, we know that total demand and total supply in a market can change, and that will shift the equilibrium point for a market. However, there are also events which generally might disrupt a market at equilibrium and have an impact on both supply and demand. So let's take a look at what some of these might be. Terrorist attacks certainly apply here. Thinking back to the 9/11 event, the terrorist attacks on the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and the air flight that crashed in Pennsylvania had enormous impact on the airline industry and other travel-related industries. Weather can have an impact on markets at equilibrium. This could be illustrated in a number of ways based upon what Hurricane Katrina did to the many markets within and around the city of New Orleans. Natural disasters can do the same, disrupt the market at equilibrium. Scandals and political strife. At the end of Chapter 5, I gave you a couple of examples of how demand would be affected in a market based upon a certain event happening. I would like to do the same now at the end of Chapter 6, but bring both demand and supply together. In other words, a study of integrated demand and supply based upon changes in market conditions. So let's look at a few examples. Before we begin looking at examples, here are 4 suggestions for figuring out demand and supply graphs based upon market condition changes. First, don't think too hard or overthink what's going on. Second, identify which curve will be affected first, meaning in the short term, and why. Then determine whether it's having an impact as an increase or a decrease in the market for that particular curve, and then just draw it.
So let's practice illustrating the effects of changes in market conditions using a couple of examples. And in these examples, we will be using the tool that is in front of you right now to illustrate the changes. And before we begin, I guess with regard to this tool, I should ask a simple question. Are there any questions over it? Because if there are at this point, based upon what we've been through in chapters 5 and 6 now, we probably have some serious problems. We're going to be using the standard supply and demand graph. So all kidding aside, let's take a look at our first market and our first change in conditions to that market. That first market we'll look at is the market for oranges. And the event that causes a change in market conditions is the following. What happens to the market for oranges when a frost hits Florida? Now, frosts are known to kill off citrus crops, and in some cases, if it's a hard enough frost, actually kill off a number of the trees in orchards. If you have less trees or kills off the harvest, the crop, obviously you're going to have a decrease in the physical availability of the resources for the market, the trees and the oranges. And if you have a decrease in the resources, you cannot supply the same amount to the market. So in this case, based upon this change in market conditions, we have a shift of the supply curve to the left to reflect a reduced supply to the market. Let's take a look at another example.
The next example uses the market for CDs. You may remember CDs as the way to have your music portable before you were able to download an MP3 file or the like to your cell phone or MP3 player. The condition or event for the CD market is as such. What happened to the market for CDs when the price of CD players, which were also fairly portable, went down? Here we had a decrease in the price of a complementary product. And with that decrease in price for the player, people could wind up spending less on the player and have more money to spend on their CDs, which increased the demand for CDs. And it moved the demand curve to the right. In our next example, our market is beef. What happens to the market for beef when the cost of feed grain goes up? Feed grain is a variable cost or expense for beef producers. If there is an increase in the price of feed grain, the beef producers will keep less cattle, and less cattle means that there will be less beef supplied to the market. In our next example, let's stick with the market for beef. The event is different though. The United States economy goes through a boom period. So what happens to the market for steak? Well, if economic conditions are good, usually people's incomes are increasing as well. Steak is a normal good, and with an increase in income from the good economic conditions, there would be a greater demand for normal goods. So the demand for beef and steak would increase. The market for our next example is sport utility vehicles and trucks. Now here's an event that we have seen a couple of times in the past with the same results from the event. And I'm sure that we're going to see in the not too distant future this type of event again with probably the same results. So here we go. The price of gasoline doubles. what happens to the market for sport utility vehicles and trucks? Well, gasoline is a complementary product to the sport utility vehicles and trucks. And with the price of a related product complement, the cost of ownership for sport utility vehicles and trucks increases as well, and rather dramatically. This winds up reducing the demand in the market for these types of vehicles. With our next example, we'll continue along with the automotive market, but in this case focus on foreign cars. Here's our event. United States automakers invent hybrid technology. What happens to the market for foreign cars? Now, this is an interesting example for two reasons. Number one, this is another example of something that truly happened. All right, to be fair with you, it was really the other way around. Foreign car makers invented the hybrid technology, and the question came up in reality as to what happened to the U.S. automakers. Well, be that as it may, we'll use this current situation here as described. So it's interesting because it is a true situation that actually occurred. And number two, we have to dig a little bit deeper in our thought process as to how the market is affected. The hybrid car forces us to think about total cost of ownership of the vehicle. And what I mean by that is not only the cost of the car itself, but also what it takes to run the car, meaning the gasoline. Now, a hybrid car is pitched as being less expensive from a cost of ownership standpoint as the price of gasoline goes up. So overall, for the life and use of the vehicle, the hybrid car, which is a substitute to the other car, the price of it is less from a cost of ownership over the time that you would own the car. So as a result of that, in this case, U.S. automakers' car, the hybrids, are cheaper to own. Well, I shouldn't say cheaper, but less expensive to own. So you would see a fall or decrease in demand for foreign cars. Having now looked at numerous examples coming through chapters 5 and 6, you might be thinking, hey, I have a pretty good handle on this supply and demand stuff. But all we've done is look at the short term. So in wrapping up chapter 6, I'd like to complete the entire picture by also looking at long-term effects on markets. To provide a simple illustration of long-term effects, let's go back to one of the examples that we looked at earlier. It's the example of the market for CDs when the price of CD players went down. What happened to demand and supply over the long term? In this case, we saw that there was an increase in demand for CDs because people paying less for the CD player now had more money to spend on CDs. Well, when you have a situation where there's an increase in demand for a product in a market, that is going to attract more suppliers. And more suppliers coming into the market will also push down prices. So the long-term effect of this had on the market was an overall decrease in prices and more availability of CDs. For our last long-term example, we're going to look at the market for CD players and what happened to it with the introduction of the MP3 player. With the introduction of the MP3 player and the new technology, we saw a rapid decrease in customer preferences for CD players. The demand for CD players fell off dramatically. The only way they could be moved and consumed was by offering a lower price point. Now, with lower price points, we know that some suppliers will leave a market. But the market for CD players did survive until the price of the MP3 player came down so much lower than when it was first introduced. So you see here in the interim, what happened is that the market for CD players adjusted to a new equilibrium point as some suppliers continued to supply the market, but many left. This brings us to the end of Chapter 6 in our look at supply. In Chapter 7, we'll be looking at prices, and we look forward to seeing you there.